I would love to talk about peace and development and many other uplifting issues. But in the last few weeks, the world has experienced crises, one of which is still ongoing, involving nuclear powers. One in South Asia, one in the Middle East, and the third one in Europe, in Ukraine, but not essentially over Ukraine. One of the most striking revelations of 2025, not just for me, but for many of my colleagues here in Moscow, has been Europe moving toward the front line of the conflict in Ukraine and turning itself into the main adversary, a near enemy on the battlefield for Russia in the West's proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. In my view, this is out of two developments. One is Russia beginning to win the war in Ukraine. The other one is the United States under the Trump administration deprioritizing Europe to focus more on Asia, essentially on China. In this new environment, the analysis of my colleagues and myself goes, Europe's leaders found it useful to cast Russia into the role of the enemy at the gate as the main vehicle for further consolidation of Europe into a power center, into a strategic actor. And standing up to Russia has been elevated to the almost to the new unifying idea for Europe. After achieving peace among European nations, after the Second World War, after the unification of Europe, rather absorption of Eastern Europe into a greater European Union, the current grand idea of European integration seems to be standing up to the barbarians in the East. This notion is based on the, in my view, ludicrous assumption that Russia is poised to attack Europe in the medium-term future, next 3 to 5 years. You don't ask where this sort of intelligence comes from, because even asking that question could put you into the position of, into the category of a Putin agent. But this is widely accepted among the normally critically minded people of Europe. From the Russian side, it looks like Europe is not only talking about potential Russian aggression in the medium-term future, is not busy deterring that aggression, but actually is preparing to fight against Russia in the next 3 to 5 years. This is different from the Cold War period, when I think the emphasis was very much on the Cold War confrontation. Today, the situation is much more dynamic and thus much more dangerous. And I think that this is being taken with more and more concern in Russia, because, as I said, this comes as a revelation. For decades during the Cold War and even after the Cold War, Europe was seen more or less as a group of vassals to the United States, countries that have become totally pacifist or near pacifist, that they were only serving the interests of the United States. This notion is being revised across the board in Russia. As I said, Europe is now in the front line, is in the historical position, unfortunately, of a group of countries that are preparing for military engagement with Russia. So Europe's involvement into the war continues to grow. Europe is replacing the United States as the main purveyor of arms and munitions to Kiev. It is upgrading the systems it has been transferring to Kiev, and that would include long-range missiles also from Germany. So essentially, Europe is getting nearer and nearer to directly participating in a war with Russia. And people are also talking about European troops being potentially sent into Ukraine, despite the many, not only protests, but warnings from Russia that this was intolerable and would constitute a very dangerous act. So we are deeply struck also, me included, because I spent a lot of time in Germany in the 70s and the 80s, and have been visiting the country many times, have a lot of good colleagues and many friends in Germany. But it gives me enormous pain to state that the Russian-German reconciliation, which was almost a miracle, given that it was achieved outside of any alliances or economic unions, and that it essentially began to happen when at least West Germany and the Soviet Union were on the opposite sides of the Cold War divide. That this reconciliation that was cemented by Moscow's acceptance of and actually support for Germany's reunification 35 years ago, that this reconciliation is no more. It's in tatters, and it's a tragedy in my view. Something that I personally hailed as a miracle, that was totally incredible. One of the things that you cannot expect to happen. It did happen, but then it became undermined progressively. I would say over the past 20 years, it has been undermined, and then it sank before our very eyes. Let me conclude by saying that we find ourselves at a very European leaders, if I may call them that way, would delude themselves in thinking that Russia will not respond, at least not retaliate against themselves, against the European powers, for what they are doing in Ukraine and the weapons that they are sending to Ukraine to hit Russia. Let me also say that This point is more dangerous. The point that we're going through is more dangerous than almost anything else we've seen during the Cold War. And I would say that it's more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And one of the predictions that I hope we can still avert, I hope we can still make sure that it doesn't happen, that this present crisis will not stop until and unless we look into the abyss like they did in 1962 and step back from that. But unlike in 1962, the new nuclear crisis that could put in question the continued existence of much of the world, if not the entire world, will not happen over there, will not happen in the Caribbean or anywhere else. It looks like it is going to happen unless in this 11th hour we mount a joint effort to achieve an agreement that will stick, an agreement that will stabilize the situation in Europe's east. Finally, let me say that things could have been averted. This crisis would have never happened, but for NATO's enlargement reaching Ukraine, and I would say initially also Georgia. The idea that Ukraine would become a member of NATO, that was the real red line that led to this war. The crisis in Ukraine could have been prevented or could have been stopped in its tracks, and the situation could have been stabilized had the Minsk agreement of 2015, 10 years ago, been honored by all parties. But this agreement, as Frau Merkel confided into us some time ago, was seen as simply a means to win time for Ukraine's rearmament. We could have stopped the war that began on a large scale in 2022 had the Istanbul draft treaty been signed, but in fact it was torpedoed by the joint efforts of the United States and the United Kingdom. We haven't used the three chances, so it may be that God has run out of chances to give us. But I still hope that we can avoid the worst. Let me leave you with that hope. But the situation is really dire. Thank you very much. And apologies for bringing a lot of dark clouds to the horizon of the Schiller Conference. Thank you.